Hello, everybody. My name is Jakob Hallgren. I am the Swedish ambassador to the Republic of Korea. I would like to welcome you all to Democracy in the Times of Corona. This event is co-hosted by the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul and International IDEA, the International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance. I'm so incredibly glad that we could organize this important and I think very timely discussion. And it takes place both virtually with global participation, quite a few countries, and also live with an exclusive audience here at the Swedish residence in Seoul. While we're only some 10 people here at the Swedish residence, respecting social distancing, we're almost 500 people joining, so it's really great to have you. So today we're going to look into issues of how democracy is coping with the existential challenge of COVID-19. And this with three prominent democracies in the spotlight. It's Australia, it's the Republic of Korea, and it's Sweden. So we will look at how this pandemic has affected elections, institutions, trust in government, among other things. And a key reason for us to organize this event today is the Swedish government's drive for democracy. And that is a policy that stems from the conviction that we all have a duty to raise awareness of the fact that democracy is actually in decline in the world today, and that we also have to mobilize all the support and good forces for the fundamental principles of democracy. Now, I hope that today's discussion will both make us wiser and maybe give us hope and some good ideas of how to defend and expand democracy and democratic values. And we have an amazing program today. First, we're honored to have a first high-level panel with no less than 3 foreign ministers, the foreign ministers of Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden, and with that, the Secretary General of International IDEA. That's quite amazing, I think. And after that first panel, we're going to have a short break. And as a second part of today's event, and I really encourage you to stay for that, we will have a fascinating expert panel with 3 professors and an eminent expert from International IDEA. And during this latter session, you will all, both you here in the live audience and all you out there, will be able to put questions. I really encourage you to start to think of questions that you can send in to us online. Now, I will soon give the floor to Dr. Kevin Casasamora, who is the Secretary General of International IDEA and who will be our moderator for this high-level session. Dr. Casasamora has more than 25 years' experience in democratic governance as a researcher, as an educator, and also as a public official. And I think he embodies a rare combination of a distinguished academic career, strongly focused on electoral systems and democratic institutions, with also practical experience as a high-level public official in his native Costa Rica, but also in international organizations. So with this, and without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Dr. Casasamora. Please.
Ambassador Hallgren, and to the Swedish Embassy in Seoul for co-organizing this event alongside International IDEA in record time, I should say. And this is a part of Sweden's drive for democracy, which is a key priority of the Swedish government, one which we at IDEA enthusiastically support. For those of you who are not so familiar with International IDEA, we are an intergovernmental organization with 33 member states with the exclusive mandate to support and strengthen democratic institutions and processes around the world. Our work has a dual nature. On the one hand, we produce cutting-edge, comparative and policy-friendly knowledge of matters related to electoral processes, political partisan representation, constitutional processes, and democratic governance writ large. And on the other hand, we help to apply this knowledge on the ground through technical assistance aimed at policymakers, civil society groups, institutions, public authorities at the national and local levels. This year, we happen to be celebrating our 25th anniversary, and for that reason as well, we are particularly glad to co-organize this event together with one of our founding member states and our host country, Sweden, and to have another founding member state, Australia, taking part in this event. We're truly grateful to both of you for the support that your countries have provided International IDEA for the past 25 years. But we're also very honored to have the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea joining us today, especially through our Asia Pacific regional program. We have been very grateful for the different collaboration opportunities with the Republic of Korea and the ability to draw on the important democratic experience and expertise of its institutions. Now let me say a word about the topic of this webinar. We have all witnessed in the past 3 months or so that the coronavirus pandemic is drastically changing the world, causing disruption of a magnitude probably not seen since the end of the Second World War. Aside from the global health crisis that has caused over 400,000 deaths already, the world most likely will be faced with a destabilizing, profound economic crisis. It already is. But also, in our view, there will be profound political implications that stem from this pandemic. Until now, political leaders at all levels have been responding to this crisis with an unprecedented set of measures aimed to curb the spread of the virus, protect public health, and keep the economy afloat. Around the world, authoritarian regimes have started using the crisis to silence critics and tighten their political grip on power. But even some democratically elected governments are fighting the pandemic by amassing emergency powers that, in many cases, restrict fundamental rights. While the use of extraordinary measures and emergency powers can be justified to address the current health crisis, some measures, such as silencing critical media and arresting journalists, harassing civil society groups, or using minorities as scapegoats, are much harder to justify from the democratic standpoint. In the upcoming discussion, we're going to deliberate on what the current corona pandemic means for democracy and for democracy support in general. But we'll do so through the lens of the cases of Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden. As per the International IDEA Global State of Democracy Report of 2019, which is one of our flagship products, all three, Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden, are among the highest performing democracies in the world. But their strategies and responses to the pandemic have varied, revealing the nuances and the importance of national contexts. So we hope that the discussion will reveal some interesting insights on, first, how democracies can balance mitigation of the outbreak while still respecting democratic principles such as accountability and transparency and full respect for civil and political rights. Second, we expect the discussion to highlight the importance of robust institutions, of levels of societal trust and access to information when dealing with a pandemic without undermining democracy. And therefore, I think the lessons learned from the experience of Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden are very germane to this discussion. And number three, I certainly hope the discussion will shed light on the medium and longer term implications of COVID-19 for democracy. So these are some of the issues that our speakers will be dealing with today. Before we get to the questions and the dialogue that I hope to have with our very distinguished guests, I am very honored to welcome the three foreign affairs ministers that will take the floor for all too short 5 minutes to do some introductory remarks. And we'll start with Her Excellency Senator Marise Payne, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Australia. Senator Payne has been a senator for the state of New South Wales in her native country for more than 20 years and has served most recently as Minister for Defense between 2015 and 2018. But before that, she was a Minister for Human Services, and she held several shadow ministry level positions. So without further delay, Senator, Minister Payne, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Secretary General, and good evening from Australia. Thank you for inviting me to speak with you all tonight. And it's very good to see my counterparts again, Anna and Kung Hwa. Wonderful to join you virtually again. We have been taking the opportunity in these times of COVID-19 to catch up virtually in some very valuable exchanges. Secretary General, can I thank you and International IDEA for hosting this webinar with His Excellency the Ambassador of Sweden to the Republic of Korea. I think our discussion today provides a good platform for democracies like ours to reiterate the importance of key values and principles of transparency, of accountability, the rule of law, the international rules-based order, and human rights. Importantly, we can't afford to let COVID-19 distract us from the need to both protect and promote these principles and to call out instances where we see them being undermined. These are core values and principles which guide Australia's engagement, particularly as a member of the UN Human Rights Council, as we do emerge from this crisis and look to recovery. To this end, we warmly welcomed the World Health Assembly's consensus on the need for an independent, impartial and comprehensive evaluation into COVID-19. We called for such a review because as a democracy, we know that openness and transparency are essential to learning the lessons of the pandemic. And we look to countries like Sweden and Korea to work with us to improve global pandemic prevention and to build the capability of key multilateral agencies like the World Health Organization. So while democracies are dealing with the pandemic's impact and grappling with the challenges of recovery, we have seen some actors use this as an opportunity to undermine democracy and to promote a much more authoritarian agenda, and the Secretary General made broad reference to some of those. One in our own region here in the Indo-Pacific is the decision by China's National People's Congress to pass new national security laws that will be imposed on Hong Kong. With a number of international counterparts, particularly from Britain, from Canada and from the United States, we have expressed deep concern about this decision, which was taken, importantly, without the direct participation of the Hong Kong people. There is genuine concern that the legislation will undermine one country, two systems, that it will erode human rights and individual freedoms, that have been guaranteed by the Basic Law and by the 1984 Sino-British Joint Declaration. Further, we see the particular importance of online information during the pandemic, which has created space for disinformation. And that disinformation is literally, specifically, purposefully designed to sow order and distrust. And that has happened in multiple examples around the world. So we are all being tested. Australia will always support the right to peaceful protest. But even peaceful gatherings like the Black Lives Matter protests that took place in Australia across the last weekend in support of the global movement, even they are, as we see them, forcing societies and governments to make difficult decisions about the balance of respect for civil and political rights with the safety of communities, indeed including the safety of protesters themselves. And this is a matter of some discussion and debate, including here in Australia at the moment. But ultimately, that's where democracies are able to show their strength, their true strength, with openness, with accountability, and with respect for individual human rights. Democratic systems can encourage the confidence of their populations, even in the midst of a crisis. I wanted to cite an example around gender equality as well as one example of a human right, which is a strong feature of liberal democracies, which empower women's leadership, which enhance their safety, their security, and their economic opportunity. Gender equal policies enable us to lead to more prosperous and sustainable societies without the disparities which are often common in authoritarian regimes. Many would say that democracies may sometimes look imperfect, and they, like most things in life, are rarely 100% perfect. But with the airing of disagreements, with the admission of mistakes where they're made, they can be stronger for it, because self-governed people ultimately have the trust in a common mission. That is being proven again through the COVID-19 crisis, and hopefully will support our process as individually and together we work towards recovery. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Payne. I'd now like to invite Her Excellency Kan Kyun-hwa, Foreign Minister of the Republic of Korea. Dr. Kyun-hwa has been the Senior Advisor on Policy to the United Nations Secretary General and was previously the Deputy High Commissioner at the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. And those are merely the highlights of a very long and distinguished career in the diplomacy of her country. Please, Minister, Doctor, the floor is yours.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to join you for today's webinar. I'm really grateful to the Swedish ambassador here, Ambassador Hellgren, and the International IDEA for hosting this very timely and important event. And it's wonderful to see my friends Maurice and and the other friends from Australia and Sweden, and of course the other distinguished participants on an issue of such great importance at this critical time for the world. As we all say, the impact of COVID-19 pandemic has been overwhelming in all aspects of our lives and has exposed and deepened the existing social, economic, and political fault lines in our own countries as well as in the international community. And some of the fundamental values that we are used to taking for granted, such as democracy and human rights, have been threatened and come under doubt. Indeed, in the early stages of the pandemic, there were questions over the effectiveness of democracies in the fight against this fast-spreading virus, while some of the authoritarian governments seem to be successfully flattening the curve. And even in countries long committed to democratic values and human rights, concerns were raised and still continue about the use of digital technology in the efforts to contain COVID-19, turning into tools of mass surveillance and control to the detriment of fundamental human rights. Korea, as you know, was one of the first countries to be hit by a huge surge in COVID-19 cases. And by necessity, more than choice, we have been a few steps ahead in trying to curb the virus while also dealing with these and other tough questions. And for a while, as the surge kept climbing, it seemed as if it could spiral out of control. But thanks to the whole of government efforts and active engagement with citizens in massive testing, contact tracing, and treatment, we managed to flatten the first big wave. And it was during this time of a plateauing curve in mid-April that we held our nationwide parliamentary elections on schedule. But alarmingly, the curve has turned upwards again recently due to some cluster infections in the metropolitan Seoul area, originating from nightclubs, logistics centers, religious facilities, and other places where large numbers of people gather in close proximity. Clearly, there is no room for complacency against this virus, which travels very fast and very silently because people without symptoms can be infectious. So we continue to adapt our measures to the changing pattern in the spread of the virus while sticking to our principles of full transparency and openness. I think in the previous session of this webinar, Dr. Casas identified 3 areas of concern for any democratic regime in this time of global crisis, namely freedom of movement, freedom of information, and elections. And I'm very reassured to know that they are indeed the same elements that my government has worked hard to safeguard while fighting COVID-19. And indeed, I think it is safe to say that because we have preserved the 3, our fight against COVID-19 has been effective and sustainable. On the freedom of movement, this has been the key pillar of our principle of openness. We have kept society open without a wholesale lockdown or shutdown. We have sought balance between the virus containment measures and sustained economic and everyday life activities. Without closing the border, we have managed the inbound traffic of people, both Korean and foreign nationals, without discrimination, with measures that are proportionate to the changing risk of the virus coming in with the travelers. We were able to do this because of our robust testing and tracing regime, which quickly identifies positive cases and their close contacts so that they may be quarantined and the rest of society can freely move about. And without these, I think keeping society open and preserving the freedom of movement for the general public would have been much more difficult in one of the most densely populated countries in the world. On freedom of information, this has been served by the uncompromising transparency that has guided government action from the very beginning of the crisis, even when government measures were failing to meet public expectations. For example, over the issue of the facial mask supplies, I can't tell you for how long we have struggled with this issue until we got the formula right, but it took us nearly 2 months of much criticism from Parliament, from the media, and we almost felt we couldn't do anything, but we were patient, and in the end, with some help from the private sector, we were able to come to a solution. But full disclosure about what we know and don't know about the virus spread and government actions through the twice daily public briefings and Q&As with the press has required much work. But this has also won the trust of the people that the government was doing our very best. We may not be satisfactory, but at least we were trying our very best. And this also prevented panic buying and other mass behaviors that can be fueled by distrust in government. And of course, the clearest confirmation of that trust was the highest voter turnout in nearly 3 decades for the April 15 elections. Furthermore, our disease control and prevention law stipulates the public's right to know about health risks that could affect them. And this has been fulfilled by public service alerts delivered to smartphones about the anonymized trajectories of positive cases. And I think the concern over the privacy of the patient is rather overblown because what is shared through the alerts is only the location and the time of the places along the trajectory of a patient without indicating his or her name, occupation, or address. And this public trust in government has translated into civic participation and cooperation in the stringent social distancing measures and other guidances advised by the government. It has also encouraged citizens to come up with creative solutions to complement the government actions. And indeed, our now famous drive-through testing was proposed by a young doctor. The distribution of the facial masks has been greatly facilitated by applications developed by private citizens. And there are such myriad of such applications, and the government work has been then to scale up the useful solutions so that they can be made available countrywide. On elections, the IDEA report on our nationwide elections of April 15th is very comprehensive, thorough, and I greatly appreciate it. And I do concur with the conclusion that our experience may not be applicable in other countries, but still, our National Election Commission has been organizing webinars and online symposiums with election management authorities of various countries to share our experiences. And these have been very lively, productive, and I'm told very, very detailed. Every country context is unique, and ours may not be the best practice to consider for many. We have a very advanced IT infrastructure, which has certainly been painful. But more than the IT, it has really been the human power in tracing. It has really been the epidemiological teams who investigate all the sites along the trajectory and interview the people around so as to identify the close contacts. And no amount of technology can replace the legwork and the human touch of these teams of professionals and trained volunteers. And I'm sure for the April 15th elections too, there were lots of data platforms and digital technology mobilized in the run-up, during, and after the day. But what mattered most for the people to feel safe in coming to exercise their constitutional rights was the human face, the workers, the staff of the Central Election Commission, and the countless volunteers who guided the voters through long queues, took their fever checks, helped them to use hand sanitizers and put on disposable gloves outside the voting stations, checked their identities against the residency registry and handed out the voting slips, made sure their slips went into the ballot box, and then escorted them to the exit. So in the end, I think technology is only as good or bad as how it is used, and we have certainly endeavored to use it wisely with full accountability to the people. We are a government about serving the people, and I think the failures of the recent past make us particularly keen on this point. But in the end, this is the whole point of government, any government, that is to serve the people and do our very best to keep them safe and secure. And I am sure everybody can agree to that point. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister. Fascinating remarks. Last but not least, I'm pleased to invite Foreign Minister Ann Linde of Sweden. Minister Linde has had a long and distinguished career in public service in her country. Before she became Minister of Foreign Affairs, she was Minister for Foreign Trade, Minister for EU Affairs and Trade, and State Secretary at the Ministry of Justice. Please, Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, dear guests, friends, let me first extend my thanks to International IDEA and the Swedish Embassy in Seoul for hosting this important conversation on the implication of the COVID-19 response for democracy and the rule of law. I want to especially thank International IDEA and you, Secretary General Kevin Casas-Zamora, for moderating this webinar and the work you're doing in IDEA. And also my colleagues, Foreign Minister Maurice Payne and Foreign Minister Kang Kyung-hwa. And I think it's fascinating how often we see each other and talk to each other in this pandemic, even though I long for some personal meetings again. But still, it's not only bad. I look forward to this discussion today, and I also want to thank those of you who take part via the internet. Today's webinar is the latest in a series of democracy talks held at the Swedish missions around the world. The themes has ranged over a number of topics: violence against women during quarantine, women's and girls' mental health during the pandemic, media freedom, safety for journalists, and the protection of human rights defenders, among other themes. With the COVID-19 pandemic, the world faces a common difficulty. Different strategies to deal with the spread of the virus have emerged. In some countries, decisions have been taken to detriment of fundamental freedoms. We need these restrictions to end as soon as the pandemic allows it. To stop the spread of the virus effectively while staying true to democratic ideals can be a challenge. Every opportunity to learn from each other's experience is a welcome one. Fundamentally, we all share the same goal: to save life and protect public health. Sweden is dealing with the same challenges, and we are using similar tools as most other countries, promoting social distancing, protecting vulnerable risk groups, and reinforcing our health system to cope with the pandemic. In order to counter trends of backsliding democracy and weakened respect for human rights, our government is pursuing a global drive for democracy. In the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen that our drive for democracy is as relevant as ever. We receive reports of potential negative effects of measures to combat COVID-19 on civil society actors, human rights defenders, and media workers. Sweden is working hard to make sure that human rights, democracy, and the rule of law are put at the heart of the global response to the coronavirus in the short as well as in the long term. We have therefore gathered the United Nations, the EU, the OSCE, and the Council of Europe to see how we can mobilize internationally. I've held meetings with both national and international civil society actors about the effects of the corona on human rights. Sweden priorities include supporting and strengthening the civil society, strengthen respect for freedom of expression and information, and reducing inequalities. We need to commit to creating and upholding the public trust in democratic systems and institutions. There are aspects to democracy which we need to uphold despite the pandemic, such as labor rights. It is crucial to ensure transparency and access to reliable information. The right to health not only depends on accessible health care, but also to the possibility of staying informed. We must also effectively counter disinformation, as there are those who are trying to make use of the pandemic to sow discord and weaken the public's trust in democratic institutions. Any emergency responses and restrictions in response to COVID-19 must be in full compliance with international law. This, of course, applies to my own country, Sweden, as it does to any other country. Now, during the crisis, as well as after, we must remain vigilant, because when we come out of this crisis, we must ensure that our standards has not shifted. In the aftermath of all this, we will face a battle of narratives revolving around which form of government countered the outbreak most effectively. In this, all of us have an important task in promoting the advantage of democracy and arguing for a democratic, human rights-based approach to countering COVID-19. We want to think together and consider how we can act together with multilateral actors, like-minded countries, and civil society. This pandemic has made it clearer than ever that international cooperation is key to overcoming this crisis. I look forward to today's discussion on how COVID-19 affects our democratic institution and to hear more of your thoughts on how we can safeguard them moving forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Minister Linde. A truly interesting set of remarks we have. And I would like, if you allow me to ask a few questions, trying to zero in on some of the distinctive features of the response that each country has attempted in the face of COVID-19. And here I would like to start with Minister Payne. One of the things that sets Australia apart in this panel is that it is a federal country, where decision-making powers when it comes to COVID-19, including the lifting of restrictions, is shared between the federal government and subnational governments. How have the federal and state governments come together in the midst of this crisis? How do you deal with the inevitable frictions that emerge in the course of that interaction to deal with the pandemic?
It's a very good question, and in the over 30 years that I've spent in and around politics in Australia, I have never seen an approach like the one that has been taken by my Prime Minister and by the state and territory ministers. So to start with, it's worth understanding that my Prime Minister shares political background with a number of the state and territory chief ministers and premiers, but not all. So in bringing together a group which has become known as the National Cabinet, so the Prime Minister and the Premier of every state and the Chief Minister of each territory, in bringing that together, it's a multi-party approach. And Australia has a robust party democracy, split very clearly between two major parties and then a series of minor parties. So this is a very unusual endeavour. Typically, our states and territories run the service delivery entities, the schools, the hospitals, they employ the frontline health workers. So in the best way to coordinate that, it was thought we should bring together this national cabinet. And it was highly successful and continues to be so. Sometimes at the height of the pandemic in the last few months, it has met more than once a week, dedicating hours and hours of leaders' time to that process. It's turned into a fortnightly meeting, and the tempo has slowed slightly. But what is, I think, really important for this discussion is that it has been so effective that the Prime Minister and the National Cabinet have determined to continue with this arrangement as a national arrangement beyond the pandemic, particularly as we take forward work on economic planning, on jobs, and on recovery. And in terms of points of friction, as has been raised, one really significant issue is the difference that states and territories are making around the easing of restrictions in their social isolation requirements, their social distancing. So the National Cabinet agreed on a 3-step framework, and the plan is agreed. But each state and territory will make their own decisions based on their individual circumstances, their local conditions as to timing of its implementation. So there are still internal different approaches to resolution and to timing, but the plan is agreed. So it is unique, and I've been very interested as a long-term observer and practitioner of the political process in Australia to see it play out.
Thank you so much. It is fascinating, how this enormous crisis is creating opportunities for democratic renewal, and for political actors to come together in more constructive ways. Now I would like to go to Minister Linde in Sweden. As we know, the Swedish approach to deal with the pandemic has attracted a lot of attention. And I can tell you that even my friends in Costa Rica keep asking me about what Sweden is doing, because Sweden has not implemented the same strict measures and shelter-in-place orders that other countries have adopted. This quite clearly, at least to me, living in Sweden, one of the interesting things about this is that I have to say that it's the defense that the government has done, this approach, is a very articulate one. I mean, this is not something that was concocted out of thin air. There's an underlying philosophy behind it. Can you, Minister, please explain us a little bit about the approach and the underlying philosophy? And can you tell us a little bit about how this approach is resulting in so far?
Yes, thank you. Yes, there is a very high degree of interest in many countries, and not the least because President Trump now at least 5 times has referred to our strategy. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, sometimes it's nothing that is absolutely is not. So that, of course, creates a lot of questions. I had to answer New York Times this morning, for example, on herd immunity. And let me just state, we don't have a strategy of herd immunity in Sweden. Actually, we have more or less the same goals as every other country to have the well-being of our citizens first and front, to try to flatten the curve, to not get too high pressure on our healthcare system, which has been also successful. We have all the time have between 20 and 30% capacity available on the intensive care places. We also try to, of course, mitigate the effects on business and job. But the most important is, of course, to avoid death and the transmission of the virus. And here we can see that it has been very regional in Sweden. It is around the capital. And over 90% of the infected are more than 70 years old, and the middle age for the death is 82 years old. So what we have not succeeded in is to keep the virus out of the elderly care homes. And that is where we have not been successful. But we differ on other countries roughly in 2 issues. One is that we have not shut down our childcare center schools for younger up till 16 years. And now you can see in many countries that there is a discussion if it was actually necessary to close down schools, where they have done so. And we also have no regulation to force citizens to remain in their home. But the recommendation the authority is giving to stay home in the slightest of symptoms, to keep social distancing, and to wash their hand, it's followed to a very, very high degree. Still, several months after, more than 80% follow these recommendations very strictly. And that is because our system, that is different from other countries, is since the 16th century, where we have very small ministries and very big authorities. And the authorities gives recommendations, and that is understood that is not kind of tip that you could follow if you want to. You should follow those recommendations, because the public trust between interpersonal relation, between authorities and people, and between people and authorities, it goes all the ways, is very high. And that is due to also international service. It's not just something that we think. We know for sure that's in that way. So I think that there are not that big difference. We believe that it's good for the public health that people are outdoors. We believe that people should do the training, the promenades, everything. And we have managed several parts of the strategy, but we have not managed to keep the transmission out of our elderly care. And since every death is a tragedy, this is, of course, something that we are very sorry about. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Minister Linde. Now I would like to ask Minister Kyunhwa in Korea about the elections. It is, by all accounts, the elections in Korea came out very well. I mean, they were, I would say the word, a stunning success. You mentioned in your remarks that perhaps the ability of this experience to travel is limited, but probably there are lessons for other countries. And I'm pretty sure that you've been asked over the past few weeks about what those lessons might be. And one of the things I have to say that I, in analyzing the Korean experience with the election, I was particularly impressed with the prowess with which the election management body communicated the options available to citizens and the measures that they were taking. I know from your background that you're an expert in communications. So can you tell us a little bit more about the lessons that might be able to travel to other countries that emerge from the elections, and specifically comment on the issue of communications as a very important part of this successful strategy to elections?
Well, thank you very much, and very happy to be part of this discussion. But just in addition to what Marisa is saying about this whole of government approach, this has also been very successful in our country as well. We are not federal, but our cities and provincial mayors are directly elected. The hospital resources, the education resources are under their management. So it has been extremely important to create a whole of government approach under the Prime Minister, and we have met every day, in fact, since it went into action in late February, and we continue to meet. The Prime Minister no longer chairs it every day, perhaps twice a week, but it is still meeting every day, and that level at the highest level between the central government ministers and the local authorities to identify problems and blockages, find solutions, make sure that they are implemented, has really been what's driven the whole of a government response. On the elections, I think the communication bit is not something that was just for the election. It was from the very beginning, as I have said, the transparency element, which is constantly providing information to the public. And the twice daily briefings, once in the morning about this whole of government approach, what comes out of that, we brief the public. And then on the disease, the director of our Center for Disease Control does a daily briefing every day at 2 on the evolving nature of this virus, what we know, what we don't. We still don't know a lot about this virus, which is why, even though we are, looked at upon as having dealt with this successfully in the first round, who knows who's going to be judged as a success and a failure in the longer term when this is all over and we say, okay, let's take a look and see where things are. So we're not complacent, we're not out of the woods, and we remain very, very vigilant. The communication part, what I would like to say is that it has to be there on a daily basis, not just for the elections, because you need to have that trust for the public to look at what is being prepared, what is being communicated in preparations for the elections. So this, the communication, the messaging, and the transparency element all go in together. And we work very hard on the messaging, the message that needs to go out to the public. But of course, we also preserve that independence of the Electoral Commission. They are an independent body aside from any government interference or any legislative interference. So while preserving their independence, making providing all the information that was going into the preparations to the public has been part of our work. There were never any time that anybody entertained the idea that this might be postponed. I got some questions from foreign reporters, is this election going to happen? And I say, absolutely, there's, this is a constitutional right that we are determined to preserve. And I think technically it was important also, as you say, to provide many opportunities for voters to vote. For the overseas voters, for patients in hospital, we made online mail-in voting possible. For those quarantined, we established a separate procedure where they can come and exercise their right. So dispersing the voting public so that we can conduct this without people coming in a crowded fashion to the voting booth, I think it technically was an important move that we made and made available to the people. So yes, a lot of people turned out for the early voting days, 2 days before the, I think about a week or two before the actual date, there were 2 days of early voting. You could walk into any pre-identified location in your neighborhood and vote. You didn't necessarily have to go back to your district. On election day, yes, you needed to go to your election district. So by dispersing the voter turnout through a series of phased approaches, I think was technically a very wise one. And just announcing what voters needed to do on that day as they come to the booth. This was a constant messaging on a couple of our public broadcasting channels. And I think by that time, because, this was a time when we had now plateaued, it was clear that we were going into a downturn. By that time, the government already had that trust from the public. And in addition to that, being assured that every step was being taken so that the actual day, all precautions were being taken for that actual day, leaded to, in fact, the greatest turnouts in 3 decades. And knock on wood, so far, no positive cases that can be traced to any activities during that day so far.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you so very much, Minister. Well, we've gone beyond the time that was allocated, and since our very distinguished guests are extraordinarily busy people, we won't keep them longer. Though there are so many interesting questions that emerge from this discussion. I mean, questions about what we can learn from this crisis, and I guess the next panel will illuminate, will shed light on some of those questions. Questions about what to do about the economic crisis that is upon us, questions about the geopolitical implications. We could go on all day. For the time being, I want to thank you in a very sincere way for making the time for this conversation. I think we are all in this together. There's a lot of perplexity about how to cope with this. And this kind of discussion, bringing together very practical examples from democracies that have successfully dealt in their own way with the pandemic, I think helps us all. So I want to thank you, Minister Payne, Minister Linde, and Minister Kwan Wah for your generosity and your clarity. And with this, I yield the floor, or I give it back to Ambassador Holgren. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much. And I really agree with Dr. Casasamora. And thank you to the three foreign ministers for this amazing discussion. So we will now break a couple of minutes, but please stay tuned because we will come back to this expert panel in a couple of minutes. So thank you so much, and looking forward to see you soon. Please stay tuned. Thank you. So hello everybody, and welcome back to the second session of Democracy in the Times of Corona. My name is Jakob Hallgren. I'm the Swedish ambassador to the Republic of Korea, and I am really proud to moderate this session that we are co-hosting with International IDEA and where I work, which is the Embassy of Sweden in Seoul. I think we've just listened to an outright fascinating discussion among the three foreign ministers of Australia, the Republic of Korea, and Sweden, ably moderated, I would say, by the Secretary General of International IDEA. And now we're turning to what I said at the beginning, a just eminent panel of professors and experts to drill a little further into the issues that were brought up in the first session. And I urge all of you, both the people here at the residence, the Swedish residence here in Seoul, we have a small but exclusive crowd respecting social distance, and all of you who are out there to keep sending in your questions. We've received quite a few questions, and we're actually up to about 500 people following this live now in real time, which is, I think, quite amazing. There is a form that you can use where you can write your questions on the live stream page. So I look forward to hearing more from these real experts that I have here in the panel on how democracies and the institutions are coping with the COVID-19 outbreak, both the risks but maybe also the opportunities. Will it actually result in a further retreat of democracy and democratic principles, or will this be an opportunity to revitalize those democratic institutions and democratic principles? And what can we all do to influence such developments? So I'd like to, without any further ado, turn to our first speaker. Professor Cheryl Saunders, you are Professor Emeritus even, and Professorial Fellow at the University of Melbourne. You have more than 40 years' experience as an academic and a practitioner with special interests and knowledge in comparative constitutional law. You have published numerous books and articles in these and related fields, and you've also provided expert advice to support constitutional processes across the world, including in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Syria, among many other countries. So I'd like to start with you and ask you, what is your take of the discussion so far, comparing the three prominent democracies and the foreign minister's speech together with the Secretary General? And what would you like to add, or where would you like to continue? Please, Professor Saunders.
Thank you, Ambassador, and it's a great pleasure to be involved in this webinar. You know, unlike Sweden and the Republic of Korea, Australia is a federation. And this means that democracy works at two levels of government, each of which is accountable to its own parliament and its own group of citizens. And so assessing the democratic impact of the pandemic requires both those levels to be taken into account. In Australia, the public powers needed to respond to the pandemic are divided between the levels of government. For example, central powers include quarantine and external borders. State or regional powers include hospitals, schools, transport, and so on. And each jurisdiction in Australia declared an emergency under legislation of its own, enacted in exercise of its own powers. And then the governments coordinated their efforts through a new institution, rather misleadingly called the National Cabinet, comprising the heads of all government who come from different sides of politics. The National Cabinet was advised by a body comprising chief health officers from each jurisdiction. It reached a common position on key matters, but local difference between jurisdictions was accepted on other matters, reflecting different situations around the country. So some states closed internal borders while others didn't, and restrictions were relaxed at different times in different places. Some tensions emerged between the levels of government, but no more than might have been expected in an exercise of this kind, and the tensions were quite quickly patched up. And at the height of the crisis, all leaders gave daily press conferences explaining quite clearly and straightforwardly what was being done. The emergency legislation conferred extensive power on ministers. Parliaments at both levels of government were truncated, both in respect of the number of members present and in the number and length of sittings. But some sittings did occur to pass necessary enabling legislation. And some use also was made of parliamentary committees for the scrutiny of what the governments were doing. The courts continued, but without juries and with a lesser caseload, conducting hearings online. So in the end, the Australian response to the health crisis was highly effective. Its success depended significantly on public trust in what governments were doing. And despite a relatively stringent lockdown, there was significant voluntary compliance. Australian institutions were seen to be governing very effectively when an urgent need arose, and that's something on which I think we can build in the future. But for the future, the big issue will be winding back the concentration of executive power, both within jurisdictions and between jurisdictions. The response to the pandemic has enabled and encouraged this, and it will be an issue to watch very closely. So thank you. I hope that was helpful.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Professor Saunders. And this was, of course, mentioned by Foreign Minister Payne as well. It's quite amazing to see how this crisis then, in a sense, developed the Australian democracy, or you found new ways of, how do you say, reinterpreting your constitutional arrangements in a way. And I mean, you mentioned that there were some points of friction. You said very different takes on when the restrictions would be eased, etc. And you also mentioned rolling this back. I mean, if it was highly successful, will it be rolled back, or will you maybe change, you know, the constitutional arrangements of the country? What do you predict?
Well, I don't think it'll be a matter of changing constitutional arrangements. Any federation has intergovernmental arrangements, and Australia has always had those. But the National Cabinet was a new institution, really just set up in the exercise of executive power, that worked in a rather more sort of meeting of equals style than had been previously the case with intergovernmental arrangements. So there certainly is a proposal that the National Cabinet be continued. The relevant question, I think, is whether it worked because of the crisis, because the crisis was so serious, whether that culture can be continued on into less critical times is something to watch. I very much hope that it can be, but there's no guarantees.
But I guess the key point is that the Australians found a way to collaborate across borders or across constituencies that you hadn't done before in this state of emergency in a way, right?
Well, and for the purposes of this webinar, it's not just that they were collaborating across borders, which of course is necessary, but that they were collaborating across political divides. I mean, that National Cabinet brought together political leaders from very different sides of politics who in normal times disagree on many things, but they completely subsumed political backbiting for the period of the health crisis. And I think Australians responded to that and appreciated it.
That's quite amazing. Maybe we'll come back to that. So thank you so much, Professor Saunders, for those initial remarks. I'd like to turn to our next speaker, Professor Sok-Yeon Lee. You are with us here at the Swedish residence in Seoul. I'm grateful that you made it over here, despite it's actually 34 degrees outside, warm outside, and almost the same here, the inside of the residence. So Professor Lee, you are a professor of the Graduate School of Governance at the Sung Kyung Kwan University, and you direct the East Asia Collaboration Center there. You have created the Asian Democracy Research Network in 2015, where you're focusing on collaborative studies on Asian democracy. And I think your research interests include global governance, democracy, NGOs, citizen participation, etc. You have also written numerous articles and books focusing, among other things, on populism in Asian democracies, transforming global governance in middle power diplomacy, public diplomacy and soft power in East Asia, etc., etc. So, yeah, we got some quite interesting insights from the foreign minister. It's true that you really have been applauded across the world for the conduct of the fight against the virus and the elections, which seems to have or fallen in a very timely period. So what are your assessment of the reasons behind this success? Maybe we heard some from the foreign minister, but maybe you can develop this a little bit, please.
Okay, Ambassador, so you are asking what's the reason of a successful election? It depends on what do you mean by success. If we mean just the normal implementation of election, yes, it can be success. And also success means from the government perspective and ruling party, that's also success because they got the landslide victory in our general election. Let me answer in this way. For the implementation itself, as our minister has talked already, no Korean has ever doubted because of this COVID-19, we may delay our election. Never, that kind of thought never occurred to us. But if I identify several factors, I think first of all, our election day was lucky because April 15 is already, by the time we flattened the COVID-19 outbreak from the late March. So from the April, people feel less threatened. So let's say if our election happened in March, because our peak was the early March, I'm not sure, maybe our voting rate could have been decreased because our voting rate was 66%, okay? So good timing because when we just fought the COVID-19 back. Second factor is our very good the electoral system supporting the mass participation. It's already discussed because from the 2014 local election, we introduced the early voting. So usually for the Friday, Saturday, we allow the early voting, and many salarymen can vote. So if you look at compare the voting rate, this time the early election voting rate was 27%. That was twice more than the previous general election. So you can see that kind of system has made more easier to vote, and also government was very clever to persuade many voters to come out with all this, the guideline, wearing mask, and also giving the plastic glove, and that kind of also, taking the physical distance. All these things were very clever. And third, if I'm saying, well, by the time the world has praised how South Korea has done a very excellent job, so there was a kind of increasing national pride. So under this very good atmosphere, I think people wanted to support the current incumbent government has done a good job. And also that has led to the landslide victory of ruling party taking 176 seats out of 300 seats.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, that's fascinating. And I mean, leaving politics aside, I mean, the fact that you decided to introduce early voting and staggered voting over a number of days, and postal voting, that of course means that you can vote with more social distancing, purely physically. Now, one question to you maybe, and that is about, I mean, this has been a whole of government and an all-out effort, this fight against the virus in Korea. I've seen it, I live here. But what about some of these, you know, necessary political reforms, etc., that had been in discussion, whether it's, you know, party laws on campaigning, accountability of unelected institutions, etc. Do you fear that some of that might suffer, in the sense that some of that might be delayed as a result of this, with this kind of total focus on the fight against the virus? What do you think?
I guess our new national parliament is focusing on how to revive the economy and how to protect the people who are, you know, damaged by this situation. So they are all talking about the basic, the wages and how to support the less privileged class. So that will be the big debate. However, I don't think this COVID-19 situation will discourage politicians to discuss the political reform law. I saw the report from our parliament, and they are already, the research team has identified several laws to be discussed in this coming the session.
Well, thank you, Professor Lee. That sounds encouraging. So I'd like to continue and move to our next speaker today, who is joining us from Sweden, Mr. Staffan Lindberg. You are Professor of Political Science at the University of Gothenburg, my alma mater, by the way. You're also Director and Founding Principal Investigator of the VDEM Institute, which stands for Varieties of Democracy. You are a Wallenberg Academy Fellow, and you are also an author of many articles on issues such as democracy, elections and democratization, accountability, women's participation, and voting behavior. And you also have quite an extensive experience as a consultant and an advisor to international organizations. And I know that behind you stand a whole faculty of some, 15 researchers and so on. And so I'd like to ask you, Professor Lindberg, from your rich experience, what would you like to add, and where would you like to pick up here on in the discussion? Maybe partly on the Swedish example, since that has kind of been in the focus, but also wider, because I know you have a truly global outlook as well. So, Professor Lindberg, please.
Well, thank you, and thank you for inviting me to be part of this important seminar as part of the democracy talks that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Sweden are running around the globe. And I think I would like to start with saying that I think that the discussion that's been had about South Korea, Australia, and Sweden, three very strong democracies in the world, about the potential effects on democracy domestically is important to be had. But I think democracies like the three here and others who are strong and should we say consolidated democracies in the world need to look outward. I think the ministers alluded to that, at least in some of their comments. So in our democracy report that came out in March, which then analyzes trends for democracy in the entire world up till the end of 2019, shows that not only have we, as the world, been in a democratic decline, a wave of autocratization for the past 10 years, but 2019 was a particularly bad year. It was the worst year in the last decade. And now autocracies, non-democracies, if you like, are in a majority in the world for the first time in a very long while. And 1/3 of the population in the world live in countries where democracy is in decline or has already failed. EU has its first non-democratic member, its first autocracy among its ranks, Hungary. So 2019, at the end of 2019, and before we had COVID-19, the world was already in a bad situation, getting worse when it comes to democracy. And the many restrictions on freedom of movement, freedom of assembly, in some countries, freedom of speech, the concentration of executive power, not only in Australia, where I don't think it's going to be a long-term problem, but in many other places it will be. And COVID-19 is already being used by wannabe dictators in many places in the world to further strengthen their rule and ensure their hold on power. The drive for democracy that Sweden has decided as a priority for foreign policy, I think must be a priority for foreign policy and international collaborations for all democracies in the world going forward.
Professor Lindberg, thank you so very much, and reminding us of that more global, maybe duty even, and I of course fully agree of the importance of that. Still, if I just may, I think as you rightly highlighted, the three democracies discussed today have obviously suffered under the management of the crisis. We've had to take extraordinary measures, and I think the eyes will be on the three countries. How did these prominent and strong democracies actually fare? And I think maybe some of the autocracies are also maybe scrutinizing extra, and I mean even more than otherwise. And if I just may venture to ask one question, which I know has come up, and that is, you know, in Sweden, the role of the expert has risen to an unprecedented prominence. You know, with the public health official, the state epidemiologist, etc., doing the daily press briefings, whereas in many other countries it's maybe the president or the prime minister or a minister of public health, etc. We will come back to the global issues, but if I may just ask your view, do you think that in any way could be seen as a challenge in terms of accountability when we're talking about you know, a crisis which is much wider than public health, etc., if it's seen from the outside?
Not necessarily. So as I think Foreign Minister Linde said, it builds on a very long tradition, several hundred years tradition in Sweden on how to organize the relationship between the government and its ministries and the state authorities. So the state authorities have much more independence in Sweden. So the way it works in Sweden is the way it's supposed to work. And it's a slightly different sort of constitutional setup from most other countries. But we have constitutional differences. I mean, we have a federal state here among us that work very different from a unitary state. The presidential and parliamentary have to deal with situations like this within the confines of their own configurations, so to speak. In the end, the government is responsible in Sweden, just like in any country, other country. Then in our model, so to speak, then in situations like this, the state authorities, the relevant state authorities have a very important and a sort of executive role in many ways that goes beyond what other people are, or people from other countries are perhaps used to. But it has not been, and I don't see it as a problem of democratic accountability in any serious way.
Well, that's a really useful clarification. I as a Swede, I know, but I think for the benefit of the audience, that's quite interesting. So let me turn to our final speaker in the panel, Ms. Lena Rikkala-Tamang. You are the director of the Asia and the Pacific Regional Program at International IDEA. You joined IDEA in 2002, and you've been working in India, Vietnam, Myanmar, among many countries, and you've been teaching at the University of Tampere in Finland, and you've also published, as the other distinguished panelists, about democracy at the global level, on women's political participation, on inclusive democratic processes. And you are also the former Secretary General of Finland's Advisory Board for relations with the developing countries. and you're a member and a former chair of the Network Institute for Global Democracy. Now, Lena, as a person following this whole Asia and the Pacific region from IDEA, and having listened to both the foreign ministers and your colleagues and experts here, what would you like to highlight from this discussion, please?
Yeah. Thank you, Ambassador. It's been really fascinating to listen to all speakers so far. As a disclaimer, I should maybe mention I'm based in Canberra in Australia, where I have spent these past few months, and originally I come from Finland. I have 3 quick observations to make. And number one, in many ways, this pandemic has been an X-ray exposing strengths and weaknesses of institutions and societies. And the X-ray results of these 3 countries have been largely positive. All 3 are high-performing democracies with many strengths to draw from, also in times of corona, even though there are also issues to watch out for. Speakers before me discussed the role of institutions, some innovations, successful elections. So I go directly to aspects that we may need to worry about. Before the pandemic, many democracy indicators, as Staffan already mentioned, including the VDEM and also our global state of democracy indices, warned about trend of democratic declines over the last 5-7 years, and also in established democracy. In Australia, we can detect slight decline on media integrity and free political parties since 2012. In Sweden, social group equality, access to justice have been declining since 2012, whereas Korea has made steady progress on all major aspects over the last 5 years. However, the existing levels of free political parties, gender equality, independence of judiciary remain behind of many other high-performing democracies. My second point, I believe this pandemic is only going to accelerate ongoing global trends in good and in bad. And we are already seeing in very painful way how this pandemic is revealing deep-rooted inequalities in many societies. And we also know that after other pandemics, both SARS and Zika, inequalities increased. And other risks are enormous. Economic unrest, increased surveillance, increase in narrow nationalism, and so on. And my third point is that while this pandemic may well have been an X-ray of democratic institutions, it's also been a kind of a Rorschach test, you know, the psychological ink test many of us gone through when applying for jobs. You kind of see what you want to see or what you have always seen. We all read about the democratic dystopias or fantasies. And while none of those may not realize as such, I believe we are at the crossroads. And at the same time, including a great opportunity at hand to learn from this crisis. And some of those learnings are very practical and relate to workings, institutions, organizing elections, and so on. And some are probably more systemic, related to very social contracts we have had as societies, and those would require more deliberations and reflections. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Tamang. I mean, what you say, some good forces are reinforced and some good trends, or some bad trends are also reinforced. Could you maybe just expand a little bit on your last point there about the concrete institutional learnings? I mean, maybe there are easy and good takeaways that you as IDEA, I mean, you of course have the benefit that you're, by profession comparing many countries or all countries essentially at the same time. So what are the kind of good practices or good examples you'd like to highlight, if you would?
Yeah, thank you. I think first of all, I think I should say that I think learnings from previous crises were in fact applied. Australia had the preceding bushfire emergency, so a kind of crisis awareness by the leadership was there, and I think that paved the way to many good decisions. And similarly, Korea was applying lessons learned from the SARS epidemic and understanding early on the importance of shift action and so on. But in terms of practical democracy-related learnings, I think we have seen a lot of innovations. Parliaments discovered there are alternative ways of working, including remote voting, remote committee work. I'm confident that many of the special voting arrangements, including absentee voting, early voting, postal voting, e-voting, will all get more prominence after this crisis. Both Minister Payne, Professor Saunders mentioned the example of national cabinets in coordinating decision-making in a federal setup. And we have witnessed a comeback of experts based and the kind of evidence-based decision-making. And I hope that that practice is here to stay. And I think courts need to think through how to ensure access to justice, even at times of lockdown. And many nations, I believe, are now examining some of the constitutional and legal frameworks, kind of see whether those can truly pass the sort of stress test or if amendments are needed. And I think in many ways we're looking at sort of back to basics strategies and acknowledging that institutions matter.
Well, thanks a lot. And if I'm not wrong, you're actually planning to assemble some of the conclusions from this seminar today, and you've already got a good list there in your writings. It was actually, by the way, an idea brief on the elections here in Korea, which prompted this whole seminar from the very beginning. So I can only recommend reading of your papers. Now, I'd like to. In a moment, we will turn, open up to the audience and also to the online followers here. But I'd like to drill into one question. It was touched only slightly before, and this is the issues where the necessities of fighting the pandemic and the quite intrusive sometimes legislation on rules or restrictions are colliding with issues of individual privacy or integrity and for that matter the right of assembly. And we actually spoke before this seminar about the Black Lives Matter demonstration that has happened in many countries over the last weekend. So I'd like to hear just very quickly from each of you four in the panel, and I'll start with Professor Saunders and continue with Professor Lee, and then Professor Lindberg, and then Ms. Rikala Tamang. So and get your snapshot thoughts about that tension and how to deal with it. So. Professor Saunders, what do you think about that? How should we?
Yes, well, you're quite right, of course. There is a tension between protecting people's health in these circumstances and rights of all kinds, rights to freedom of movement, for example, in the Australian context. And in Australia, that particular trade-off was accepted, I think, without too much quibble, because people put such a deal of faith in the way the system was handling the crisis. But as we said earlier today, the real conflict came just quite recently during the Black Lives Matter demonstrations that took place right across Australia, capital cities, regional cities, hundreds of thousands of people marching. I mean, the actual size of gatherings varies a bit between states around Australia, but on no view do they encompass 100,000 people in the CBD. And so there was a real question, not only for people about whether they would go out and march, and clearly in a way that was contrary to the health requirements, but a real question for governments. How far hard would they clamp down on this? Would they let it go ahead? And if they did, would that complicate the health protections going forward? So I think the Australian experience on that deserves some further study to see how democratic governments reacted to that. By and large, I think it wasn't too bad.
Well, thank you. I mean, if it happens once and during a brief period of time, I guess you can find a way. But if this is going to be there for the long haul and it actually challenges rights, that might. Professor Lee, I mean, in Korea you haven't had such big demonstrations, but there's been this discussion about individuals' integrity with, you know, surveillance cameras and mobile phone mapping of people's, you know, movements, etc. So what's your take on this? Sorry, we have a problem with the microphone. No, it's better. So
louder voice. Yes.
Please start again.
Yeah. I guess in this fighting against COVID-19, every country is struggling with this dilemma between the protection of individual privacy and also some, you know, government gathering of information to share the information with the other public. So that aspect is all shared. Our case is a little bit, some people worry because we had the MARS after 2003 SARS, and then in 2015 we have MERS. And after experiencing MERS, our government consolidated this center so they can all collect the data, not just the GPS, and also credit card, and all this people's movement data. So therefore, yes, it can be very efficient, effective, but at the same time, it can infiltrate it into a privacy space. And of course, after this one became an issue, in the contact tracing map, the government erased the information of tracing after 14 days. So there is a kind of, that kind of respond to this worry. And also, during this fight against COVID-19, we had a kind of minority issues, like in Daegu, the epicenter of Korea's COVID-19, the majority of infected cases were belonging to this exclusive Christian group called the Shincheonji. So there was a very much public the criticism against this sect. And also, after the May outbreak in Itaewon, you know, there is also very antagonistic feelings revealed against the gay minority in Korea. So all these issues, you know, reminded the Korean public, you know, we have to be very careful about their religious right, even their minority, and also this sexual minority as well.
No, I agree with you, especially the issues of scapegoating or, I mean, stigmatizing minorities. I really see that. Professor Lindberg, I mean, this brings us to the global issues immediately, because this is a key issue, which I guess is a huge challenge in every country. What does your research tell us about these tensions and how that is dealt with in different democracies and not so democratic countries, maybe?
Yeah, the tension between civil liberties and fundamental democratic and human rights, in fact, and strategies to fight a pandemic is obviously at the heart here. And the key principle that's internationally agreed is that it has to be proportional. There's been very little discussion about that proportionality, I would say, even in most democracies. And that worries me a lot. People got afraid. That fear was whipped out by governments themselves and by the media. And then suddenly people across the world almost sort of accepted extreme restrictions on fundamental human rights without questioning it and without questioning the proportionality. And that worries me for the future. What about the next crisis? And what governments will use what type of situation, claim it's a crisis, and further derail human rights and democratic rights, and use further surveillance mechanisms to limit our freedoms. And to my South Korean colleague and friend here, I would say, well, they said they erased it. How do you know? Right? We will never know if the governments actually erase those traces, and the tech companies they use, that they work with, that typically preserve the right to sell that kind of information. So this is, I'm very worried that this is setting a precedent that can be used to derail democratic rights and human rights in the future.
Well, that brought us to a much bigger issue. I mean, you talked about proportionality, but essentially we're into to what extent democracy as such is backsliding as a result of an incremental increase in this type of measures. But I guess it's also up to each country and political tradition how you deal with that and the level of acceptance. Ms. Rikala Tamang, what do you make of this? I mean, as you watch the region here, and when you see this tension being handled in different ways, privacy against necessary and legitimate actions by governments, do you think it's a long-term threat to democracy?
Yes, I do believe it's a real risk as this increased surveillance relates to intrusion of privacy, relates to question of what type of data and how much of private information we want to submit out there. Maybe downloading the COVID-19 tracking app, it is a trade-off between public health and our private information. The question is, what is the acceptable trade-off? It seems, yes, both in Korea and in Australia so far, this app has been well received. And of course, the underlying worry is whether the data is used towards our best interest and whether we know for sure that is the case. I think in a democracy, what justification for obtaining any data should always be there. There needs to be justification demonstrating security, justification for accountability, that decision-making is robust and that the whole system is open to some sort of independent review. But it's also true, of course, that societies may value privacy somewhat differently. It is also contextual. But I think I do agree with Staffan that this is something we really need to keep a close eye on as we move forward and the next crises to come along. These sort of mechanisms do easily get normalized. All of a sudden, it is perfectly normal to submit all this data and all this information, which just a couple of years, months ago, was not something that we were ready to do.
It's quite amazing how the acceptance for some measures has really, changed so quickly and so dramatically. Well, thank you for your comments. We have about a bit less than 20 minutes to go, so I'd really like to open up to both our live audience here at the residence, and then I know that the questions are ticking in online. So is there anyone here at the residence who would like to put a question? So please, and why don't you just also introduce yourself and put your question, and then we'll see. If you know who to direct these to in the panel, just say, otherwise I'll ask.
My name is BJ Kim. I teach at the Korea Development Institute School of Public Policy. I was very glad to see overall discussion towards the later part going into the issues of human rights and privacy, because fundamentally speaking, I think what we are trying to discuss here is liberal democracy. Many of our speakers have spoken that democracy has been in decline, but if you be precise about it, that's not exactly true. If we define democracy as a simple majoritarian rule, in fact, democracy is doing great, because simple majoritarian rule could lead our democracies to populism. And populism is doing great in so many different countries around the world. So fundamentally speaking, it's not the simple majoritarian rule that we are talking about here. Rather, what we are talking about is the combination of two very important values. That is liberalism as a respect for human rights of the individuals and individual freedom on one hand, and then democracy as a collective choice altogether. So in that regard, I think Korea has been doing great on the second part of it. ever since the end of 1980s. And we have achieved considerable progress on the first part, the liberalism as well. In fact, in my own belief, Korea has been doing really good job within the region of Asia. I think within the Asian region, Korea may be a leader in terms of producing progress in strengthening liberalism. But still, I think we have long way to go in comparison with our perhaps friends in Europe and elsewhere. When I saw different aspects of coronavirus crisis here in Korea, as Professor Lee mentioned, in the cases of religious minority case, and also LGBT community relating to the part of town here called Itaewon here, I was nervous because I was seeing Korean success being produced up to that point as a part of aspect of collective action, the community acting together to deal with the crisis, which is something that Korea is well known for, very good at. But when we saw the issues of minorities, religious minority, and also LGBT community, I was quite nervous. I don't think we actually went off the cliff. I think we stopped at the right point and we didn't go too far. So indeed, I think we succeeded in managing those very delicate points. So I was happy to see that. But however, at the end of May, just 1 week left before actual implementation, Ministry of Justice announced their decision to require all foreigners here, residents and immigrants, non-citizens, foreigners who have lived here for 30, 40 years to receive re-entry permit when they leave this country. And this was the Ministry of Justice, not Ministry of Health, Ministry of Justice that was going to make a decision about whether this particular person who spent several decades in this country could come back to their families or not. And I was abhorred by this decision. And I was angered with my foreign friends here as well, who spent 4 or 5 decades here in this country, who love this country altogether. And so when I saw that aspect, I saw the vulnerability, the fragility of this nation in terms of in its efforts to respect human rights, individual freedom, and so on within the global scale, even though we have come a long way so far. But good news is, to conclude my remark, so I think there was one case where we realized that Korea has a long way to go on that front. But good news is that since then, the implementation date was June 1st. But since then, in the face of much criticism, I think the Ministry of Justice has taken its steps back, creating a lot of different kind of exceptions and so on. So I think that decision has become almost meaningless by now, which is a good thing. So that was a positive wrap-up, I guess, I'd like to share about the story that highlighted the fact that this country still has a long way to go on the liberalism side of this important value, liberal democracy.
Well, I guess the capacity and the capability to change decision is something that is typical for democracies. I don't know if there is someone in the panel who would like to comment on this. Professor Lee, you know the Korean circumstances maybe most in detail, or I don't know about if Professor Saunders or Professor Lindberg would like to say something about this particular example or what it represents. Who would like? Yeah, Professor Lee, please.
If I may, I think compared to the national citizens, in this the COVID-19 situation, one of the most vulnerable people are migrant workers and temporary stay foreign nationals, and also illegal workers, because they are not documented. So they are sort of in limbo. Okay, so in that aspect, South Korea is no exception in failing in taking good care of these migrant workers and the non-documented foreign workers here.
Maybe we should move on unless anyone else in the panel would like to comment on that. Do we have another question? Yeah, please, sir. And please introduce yourself as well.
Right. Hello, my name is Jason Lee. I'm a professor and drama chair at Korea University. And first of all, thank you very much for your very insightful comments. And today we are talking about democracy in the times of Corona. But actually, we should be ready for the democracy in the aftermath of Corona. And during past few weeks and few months, we have seen quite a universal phenomena of the return of big state with a very strong quarantine control, and actually the huge temptation for the ultimate unlimited budget spending, the fiscal spending. So the government is getting bigger, and at the same time, the protectionism, nationalism are growing, and that is actually feeding the populist and the extreme side, actually the both extreme side. So nowadays, the democracy is facing a big challenge in times of Corona. Then we may have two choices. One is in the aftermath of Corona. One option is going back to pre-Corona era and have to emphasize the liberalism and personal individual freedom just as before. Or do we have to be ready for a new types of democracy, and do we have to accept a new reality, and we may not be able to go back to the pre-Corona years? So what would be the likely the path we would take? And I am raising this question to any of the panels.
I think that's a fascinating question. Is democracy going to be fatally wounded by the Corona crisis or not? Professor Lindberg seems eager to take on that one. So why don't you start?
Yeah, I think it's an important point to look forward. And we then note that already before Corona, we had a wave across the world that's associated with this backsliding of democracy, that different forms of, should I say, ugly nationalism and polarization of society, whether it's sort of a Muslim nationalism in Turkey or a Hindu nationalism in India or a Christian strange kind of nationalism behind Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil, and so on. And of course in Hungary as well. And that has been emphasizing a very reactionary view on society and leading to an increase in polarization, a toxic polarization of societies. And I think the Corona pandemic has the potential also long-term to feed into this and further strengthening it. So that's another aspect. I'm grateful my colleague from Korea University brought it up. That's another aspect we need to keep track of and counteract as democracies in the world.
Thank you, Professor Lindberg. I think that Ms. Rikila Tamang wanted to come in on that one as well, so please.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I think in the post-Corona time, what is definitely needed and already should start now are the public debates, the public scrutiny, but also debate and discussions at all levels of society. People will remember what is the story that we are going to tell about this time. Is it the war to be won? Or is it the sickness to recover from? Or is this even a moment of some great transformation, as the head of IMF for people has suggested? Will people remember that they were looked after or left alone? Were people treated equally, or were some people more privileged than others? And I think those are going to be some of the critical questions to the post-Corona debate. And we've certainly seen examples of where the social contract is being broken. We have seen the plight of migrant workers walking thousands of kilometers in many South Asian countries back to their villages. And we have witnessed, and perhaps we participated, some of the Black Lives Matter demonstrations, recognizing that the social contract there was broken as well, that we are suffering from systemic racism in many of our societies. Surprisingly, when it comes to populism and populist leaders, in many places, the kind of airtime of the populist leaders seem to be, they haven't been able to get that. I just noticed that at least in Sweden, it is the Social Democratic Party had the highest ever support in the polls. Same happened in Finland, and these were both are countries where the sort of right-wing populist leaders have been lurking in the sidelines. So much depends, for sure, how the post-corona time is going to be managed, how the economic recovery is to be managed, and what is the kind of a feeling that many citizens will have after the pandemic.
Thank you so much for that reply. We still have some 5-10 minutes to go, and I really would like to honor my promise from the beginning, and that is to turn to all of those, all of you who are following us online. And as I said, we've received quite a few questions. So here's one, which I think is quite pertinent. It comes from Indonesia, where the simple question is, during a pandemic, how is it possible to go ahead with elections? Isn't it better to let the government focus on combating corona rather than to risk an increased spread by the virus? So what is the panel's advice to this? Who would like to start?
I can start.
Professor
I think
Lindberg.
it's contextual. Yes. It has to be judged from country to country. So in South Korea, we saw a very successful conduct of elections. Elections were postponed in Poland, I think for good reasons. Going ahead with the elections would have been a mistake there. It depends on where you are in the pandemic cycle. It depends on what technologies you can offer in a safe way to guarantee the integrity of the vote. It's clear that canceling or postponing elections already have been used to further sort of insulate incumbents from challengers. But elections should not go ahead in any kind of circumstances. So I don't think there's one answer that fits every situation.
Thank you, Professor Lindberg. Anyone else who would like to? Professor Lee, please.
I guess it depends on country. I agreed. The Indonesia is a huge country divided by so many islands. So even under the no COVID-19 situation, it took so many days, weeks to collect and to implement the election and to collect the votes. So it's quite understandable. However, if you are properly guide yourself, maybe with mask and or kinds of things, if it's technological innovation can be done that are fascinating. So with all due efforts, I think it's much better not to postpone election. And for the previous question by my fellow Professor Lee, I guess we have to distinguish between populism and also the post-COVID-19 economic recovery. All responsible countries are preparing, right, to pour the money from their concern was helping people out of work. Now they are moving to pouring money to create demand, to normalize the economy. So I don't think it's populism. So it depends on how much the government can absorb, right? If it's Italy's debt is already so huge, right? But South Korea, we are like a low 40s. Our politicians and public opinions are divided over these issues because we have been running our finance in a conservative way, so people worry about the rapid speed of increasing our debt ratio. But at the same time, there must be a kind of wise cap we can expand to create the demand. At the same time, we have to be very careful to spend the money, allocate the money to the necessary area, to the really the people who need that kind of assistance, rather than just giving all the money to everyone. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Professor Lee. I have another question. This one is from Iran. How can we face authoritarian regimes that hide the truth about COVID-19 and its impact? Under democratic systems, it's easy to follow up, but in certain countries without democracy, people suffer from the lack of transparency. How should we respond to them? So who would like to take on that one? Yeah, so Professor Lindberg.
Since nobody else says anything. I mean, this is a general problem with authoritarian regimes. They can hide and cheat with numbers much more than democracies can, although it's not impossible for democracies to do. And this regards COVID-19 and it regards GDP per capita growth. I mean, everything. I guess the only thing democracies in the world can do is keep on pounding them as much as you can in terms of being honest and behave better. But I'm not sure that's going to make much of a difference.
Thank you, Professor Lindberg. I saw that Ms. Ricola Talang wanted to respond to this as well, please.
Yeah, simply to add what Staffan said, as with any authoritarian regimes, you can try find the ways to support media inside the country. You can try to support regional actors, regional media to try to investigate. You can support national civil society actors, academia, independent researchers in trying to produce a bit more objective information and get that information out there. Otherwise, it is what you would try to do otherwise, either through calling out such bad practices or through the kind of different strategies of nudging, trying to find the entry points wherever you can, maybe sometimes through regional cooperation, collaboration, you may do some headways. But and I think the support to media organizations, regional media, academia, to support the counterparts in those countries would be perhaps the one possible way to get more information out.
Thank you so much. Time is... Professor Saunders, please.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. I don't disagree with anything that has been said, but I mean, the odd thing about this pandemic is it's the one thing that an authoritarian government can't cover up terribly well. I mean, they can cover up the numbers, but the fact that there is a big problem is evident to everybody and ought to be a reality that puts some pressure on the regime because as people sort of struggle to get through life.
Thank you so much. I think we're already a little bit in overtime, so I'll take just the last question, and I would like to take this one because I think it provides a little bit of a positive spin. It's a question that we've received from Sweden. So in what way can we take advantage of the pandemic to strengthen the democracy in the world? So I'd like to have some quick responses from each of the panelists. Your best tips for strengthening democracy in the midst of this pandemic. So Professor Saunders, are you ready to start?
Yes, I am. Professor Lindberg said a couple of questions ago that he was sketching the trajectory of democracy in the world and saying that countries like the ones we're talking about here are not really the major problem, that there is backsliding in a very serious way elsewhere. Of course, that's true. But countries that pride themselves on being democratic role models actually should be democratic role models. And the reality is, as he was saying, they have been sliding too. So I think that those of us who are in that fairly fortunate position should seize the moment of the pandemic, not just slide into the future, but use it not just to wind back the COVID-19 measures, but to think very hard about the other ways in which our democracy was not performing. And to use the chance where we have it of institutions having regained public trust to build on that, to build what Lena described as a new social contract. And I think we need to do that very deliberately, not just to let it all happen.
New social contract from Professor Saunders. So Professor Lee, what's your tip?
I guess we can get some good point from the COVID-19 upon democracies that this pandemic, I guess every pandemic puts the politically and economically weak populations into very, very difficult situation. They are most vulnerable people, right? And through that awareness, I think we can be, again, look at the situation like in the USA, with this pandemic hitting the African American. It's not just the police brutality. There is, as you know, the African American takes about only 14% of the American population, but they are taking 40% of, people who are dead of COVID-19. So that rekindled racial issue again, and then the world is supporting this Black Lives Matter protest movement. Likewise in Korea too, after this Itaewon, the gay community, the infection cases, I think there are more voices from the minority groups to demand the right of this the minority group. So I think there are chance we become more conscious about the very shady issues the society hasn't talked in public. So we can make this into more positive way.
That's great if it ends up giving more support for the victimized groups. Professor Lindberg, what's your tip?
Yes, so let me pick it up from there. First, let me apologize. I'm going to give you my 30 seconds take on this, and then I have to leave this because I have to give a talk in another webinar.
So we are wrapping up very soon.
Yeah, so I think 2019 was not only the year of backsliding for democracy, but it was also the year of protest. 44% of countries in the world had pro-democratic protests in 2019. It wasn't only Hong Kong and Sudan. It was very widespread. And I think the hope is that pro-democratic wave of pro-democratic mobilization bounces back once the worst phase of the pandemic is over. Let's hope for that.
Perfect.
And on that, let me say.
Sure. See you. Let's continue the discussion. Ms. Rika Latalang, what's your tip or what's your recommendation?
Well, my tip is bring back the experts to support decision-making, political decision-making, and not only epidemiologists, but also sociologists, psychologists, educators, and I have to say democracy experts too. Many of us want to make sure democracies come out of this crisis stronger, not weaker. And there is much the democracy experts and organizations can advise leaders about. And at the same time, obviously, it is the political leaders who need to bear the responsibility and the ones who have the accountability. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And actually, you all disappeared here on screen when Professor Lindberg left the meeting, which means that it's time to wrap up. And time really did fly. I think we had a fascinating discussion this afternoon. And this expert panel, I really like to thank you for your contributions. I think it was both broad and very rich. We learned about challenges, and they are indeed many. But there is also hope, as we saw at the end here. And the conversation continues. And But before we wrap up, I'd really also like, apart from you, the foreign ministers, the Secretary General of IDEA, and you, panelists here, I'd really like to thank everybody who made this event possible. And I'm thinking of the great contacts that we have had with the foreign ministries in Canberra, in Seoul, in Stockholm to make this possible. The great collaboration with International IDEA, who is our co-host and co-sponsor and our best friends in making this all possible. And last but not least, I'd really like to thank the colleagues here at the embassy in Seoul and the whole production team that made this possible. It's been led very, very competently by Ms. Victoria Rudin Sandström, and I really thank you all for making this possible. Thank you so much, and with this, I think we should wrap up and close this meeting. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thank you.